Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is Jacob Toman and today we are continuing our study on the flood. We're on part 3 where we are taking a look at modern arguments for the flood. Thus far in our series we've taken a look, an overview at the flood itself, the Genesis 6 account of the flood. We've also taken a look at some other ancient stories that have testified about global floods or massive world-changing flood-like events. And today we're taking a look at how some modern contemporary arguments and models for maybe a massive Mesopotamian flood took place. Those of you who are new to the channel, welcome. You can go ahead and like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about more video discussions just like this one. If at any point in time you would like to take a look at any of the resources or any of the citations that we are referencing today, they are located down below in the video description for your further study and benefit, and of course to point out all of the various mistakes that I most inevitably will make in presenting this particular discussion. So without any further ado, let's get into it. The Flood, Part 3, Modern Arguments. So there are a couple of modern theories about the flood that we would, as Christians, say is Noah's flood and Noah's Ark as it took place and is described in Genesis 6. Most of these modern theories revolve around the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. These are massive amounts of water, massive locations that have enough water to generate massive flooding that could potentially shift entire populations as well as flora and fauna in their particular regions. So for the most part today we're going to be discussing about the regions that are known as the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Caspian Sea. So this is mostly on your map looking at what is modern-day Istanbul, near Turkey, as well as near Greece and Russia. So our first modern theory today is called the Black Sea deluge hypothesis. It was first posited by two people named Ryan and Pittman in 1997. So this is a relatively modern theory of what was going on with the Great Flood. And maybe you've even heard of the Ryan and Pittman theory of the Black Sea deluge hypothesis. It posits a couple of things. First off, it says essentially that the Mediterranean Sea overflows about 9,000 years ago from where we were at in 1997. It overflowed into the Black Sea. So the water that's in the Black Sea and that flooded the Mesopotamian region that eventually would account for Noah as well as other regional people in the area essentially came from the Mediterranean. So if they're wondering where did all the water come from, where did this flood actually originate from, it actually came from the Mediterranean Sea according to Ryan and Pittman's research. Prior to this overflow, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake. That's the argument. This argument is based on a lot of geological data, researching the way how flora and fauna exist at different levels and different depths underneath what is now presently the water level inside the Black Sea. Thirdly, glacial melt was actually the transformational process that brought water into the Mediterranean and caused the overflow. So you might say, well, if the Mediterranean overflowed into the Black Sea, what made the Mediterranean overflow into the Black Sea? Well, it was glacial melt that transformed the Caspian and Black Sea simultaneously due to this overflow. Next up, the Bosporus Straits, which that's the strait that covers what is modern-day Istanbul, what used to be known as Constantinople. The Bosporus Strait was actually the spill point for this overflow. In other words, if you're wondering, when you're pouring out a cup of water, right, there is a particular spill point. There's one particular point on your cup where the water is coming out, where the tea or coffee is coming out of your coffee pot. Well, in this particular model, the Bosporus Strait was that spill point. That's the point at which the water overflows from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea for this particular Black Sea deluge hypothesis. Ryan and Pittman offered this as an explanation for the ancient Mesopotamian accounts of floods, and they find that the dating of the Black Sea deluge was a forceful argument for a local flood that occurred that shaped and changed the way how locals in the Mesopotamian basin would have viewed life and would have viewed the world. So, on the one hand, this is something of a compelling argument. We've got to account for where a lot of these bodies of water come from. There's some good explanations for it. And of course, if you'd like to do further research on this particular argument, this contemporary argument put forward by Ryan and Pittman, there are more links for you down below in the video description. Moving on to our second theory of the day. This is our second argument. It's called the late Pleistocene, which I'm just butchering that name. I know I am, so feel free to correct me with a comment down below. Great Flood Hypothesis. And this revolves around two massive regions. First off, the Scandinavian ice sheet, and then the Caspian Sea. But we'll get into the details here in just a moment. This was first put forward by Andrei Shapalaga, and this was first done as research in 2003 and then published in 2007. So again, pretty contemporary arguments for a flood event that's going on. Well, this particular argument for a flood is similar to the Ryan and Pittman model in that the Black Sea overflow is the origin of the Great Flood. But one of the differences is the origin of the water that enters into the Black Sea. So, while Ryan and Pittman argued that the flood came from the Mediterranean Sea, Shapalaga argued for the rise in the level of water in the Caspian Sea, which then flooded the Black Sea basin, which was at that point in time known as the Neo-Junian Lake. I don't know, I can't pronounce that. Go ahead and give it a shot. Again, feel free to correct me down below in the comments. Essentially arguing that rather than the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean Sea as being the localization point of this overflow and this buildup of water that then poured into the Black Sea, what Shapalaga is arguing for here is actually the Caspian Sea flooding and growing and overflowing and then coming through into the Black Sea through a massive, massive overflow. The cause of this all, argued, is the actual The cause of this was the melting of the Scandinavian ice sheet, which was about 7K years or so, 7,000 years before the flood dating event, as argued in this particular theory. So this Scandinavian ice sheet that is being discussed covered what is modern-day Poland, Germany, top half of Russia, as well as Norway, Finland, Sweden, and even some of England, Ireland, Scotland, etc. This massive, massive ice sheet was melting and was therefore sending out waters into what we would today consider to be the Atlantic, but then also into what is now known as the Caspian Sea. And you can see by the models here displayed right next to my slightly balding forehead that there was a much, much larger Caspian Sea according to this particular hypothesis, and it drained into the Black Sea and then maybe even potentially from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, which is then what caused so much of the flooding for the people groups who would have actually lived near the Black Sea at the time. One of the key points of this argument, as well as Ryan and Pittman's argument, is that people groups who were displaced by this weren't necessarily displaced, let's say, in Saudi Arabia or near Africa, but rather were displaced on the top half of what we would call the cradle of life, right near the Turkish basin close to the Black Sea. That's where people would have been displaced due to this particular flood event, as argued by Shapalaga. At this point, there's at least one question that comes up. Genesis and many of the other ancient flood narratives that were given that we've already studied throughout the world account for the flood via rain rather than through the overflow of water. So glacial melt, regardless of when it took place, wouldn't necessarily account for this sort of flood. So this is a very, very interesting point of contention here. We've got to wrestle with this as we wrestle with the flood and as we wrestle even with modern and contemporary arguments. These floods may have happened, these floods may not have happened, but how is it that we are going to account for these very historical accounts that are given that say that these massive floods came through rain, not necessarily through either cataclysmic or even through gradual rising of water levels, right? If these particular events came through rain, it is a much, much different scenario than, let's say, an ice cap melting over the course of thousands of years and then rising water levels then causing floods in various localized regions. So rain is actually a very, very important part of us in our study of exactly what's going on here with floods and with accounting for the various sorts of possibilities of floods, whether they be local, whether they be regional, whether they be global in scale. Next up, our second question that comes up from this is there's still great debate about the origins of the Black Sea as we know it today. So we've taken a look just at here two modern arguments regarding the Black Sea deluge and regarding the origins of the Black Sea as we know it today. We seem to have one argument on one hand from Ryan and Pittman that say, well, the Black Sea came from the Mediterranean. And then we've got another argument from Shipalaga in 2003 and 2007 that argues, nope, that water actually came from the Caspian Sea. So what exactly is the relationship of the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and the Caspian Sea? I don't know. Maybe if you want to get your doctoral dissertation, or if you're interested in becoming a geologist, maybe you could put forward a third argument that says maybe it was a mixture of the Mediterranean and the Caspian Sea coming together into the Black Sea. Maybe that could be a paper for you to write out there. But it is interesting, jokes aside, it is interesting to see that there is still debate amongst scholarship today about the origins of the Black Sea. And even if the Black Sea is one particular locale of one particular flood event, does that necessarily point to that being the event that Genesis 6 is actually referencing? Does that necessarily mean that simply because there was a flood in and around the Black Sea, that that's the flood that we are in fact studying, the deluge that we are in fact studying and referencing and learning about from Genesis 6? Do those things necessitate one another? Is it possible that there was indeed a flood in and around the Black Sea region, but maybe that flood wasn't necessarily the flood that's being referenced in Genesis 6? The third question that comes up is, assuming any of these theories are correct, do they account for the flood as recounted in Genesis? I've mentioned rain here previously, but also we've got to take locale into consideration. Does the locale that's described in Genesis actually reference or have any sort of possibility of referencing a basin or a location that is closer to the Black Sea than, let's say, closer to the Mediterranean, or let's even say that's closer towards the heart of the cradle of life, as opposed to on the top half, on the further northern half towards Turkey, as opposed towards the southern side, maybe near towards, and the eastern side, maybe near towards what is modern-day Iran and Iraq. So assuming any of those theories are correct, do they actually account for what's going on in Genesis? Do they actually describe and give us a contemporary explanation for what's going on, assuming any of them are correct? So it's a very, very interesting point of discussion and point of contention, even, I would say, in dealing with modern theories, that they may be true, but they may not necessarily reference exactly what's being described in Scripture. So we've got to actually answer some of these questions as we continue to wrestle through and learn more and study more about the flood and how it interacts with modern arguments. These are just some of the things that I would bring up if you're ever in conversation with somebody about the flood and about contemporary understandings of the flood. It's very, very widespread, at least in my circles, amongst people who are not believers, to simply say, well, any sort of flood discussion or any sort of flood reference is simply has to do with the ice caps. Well, that's a great point to start a conversation and say, well, which ice caps? Are we talking about the Scandinavian ice caps? Where did those ice caps flood into? Did they flood into the Caspian? Did they flood into the Mediterranean? Would they have actually interacted at all with the lands that Noah, as well as the other accounts in Genesis, would have actually been in? Would they have been anywhere close to those regions? Could it be that Noah, as well as his descendants, actually lived in a different region other than what we would consider today to be the cradle of life in what is modern-day Iran and Iraq and near Syria and near Israel? Would we consider it to be a different location? Would we consider it to be a more European location? And in that case, if that is the case, if that is the argument, then there's a lot more that we've got to do to actually prove to say that the people were there, rather than where all the archaeological evidence of where people were at those particular times. So lots of questions still to come up, and I don't think, I guess the summary point that I'm saying here for modern arguments is, even modern arguments with all of the contemporary technology and research that we've got don't settle the argument amongst geologists, let alone amongst the greater population. Well, thanks so much for watching. I've got a couple of questions for us to discuss today. First off, how were you educated about the flood growing up? Were you educated in Sunday school about it? Were you taught about it during your early school years? How were you taught about the flood and flood events growing up? Second question for you today is there a dominant theory today in your mind or in your circle of social life? Is there a particular dominant theory that comes up when you're discussing the flood or when events of the flood come up, whether that's melting of ice caps, whether or not that's a rising amount of water in the Black Sea or originating in the Caspian Sea? or in the Mediterranean Sea? Is there a dominant theory today in your own circles of relationships or in your own mind? Thirdly, how would you account for the amount of rain that pours down in Genesis 6? Is that even possible? Is that something that enters into your mind? Is that something that you've thought about before when considering various models and various concepts and various ideas about the flood? That the flood originated with rain as accounted in Genesis 6, not necessarily with a catastrophic river-like or overflow effect. Well, thanks so much once again for watching. Next time in this series, we'll be considering how theologians like Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, and more throughout history have explained the flood. Thanks once again for watching, and I hope today is the day that you've learned something new and exciting right here on Toman's Tome.